Hello, this is Miss Browning. We are doing our analysis of Crabbe by William Bell, and we're on journal 9. So at this point, Crabbe, it's one of the climaxes of the plot. It's a really important plot point that happens. So Crabbe has paddled his canoe over a waterfall, and he's already survived a bear attack, but now things take a turn for the worst. So there's some interesting things that I will point out in this novel, in this chapter. So the first thing is that we start off by saying it's kind of embarrassing to admit this now. So we know that Crabbe is writing this journal in retrospect, and we know that he's trying not to forget things. I pointed out in some of my other analysis that Crabbe is quite self-reflective, and he seems to, well, we're watching him really learn and grow as he tells us this story. So this is no exception. As he's going over the waterfall, he mentions again that he feels embarrassed. So I think this is highlighting for us some of Crabbe's learning. So he's admitting some things here, right? And he's justifying them, but he is embarrassed because he left the house on this trip with no map and no compass. But he didn't feel embarrassed by that because, of course, he doesn't know how to use those items. And so that was part of his justification. Now, as you can see, again, he says, I would have figured that it was pretty simple. For example, you go down a river, you cross the lake, a few portages, yada, yada, and then you just retrace your steps. But what he's realizing is in practice, it's quite difficult. So recognizing that he was ill prepared for this, and I think too, it really highlights the fact that he thought things were easier than they are. I'm going to go back to the the very start of this novel, or this text, we'll call it. We meet Crabbe in the hospital, and I remember talking about this when I did the video there. So Crabbe thinks that he's very smart, and he really resents the fact that he feels like people are trying to tell him what to do. But in this novel, and typically in a coming of age, Bildungsroman type theme, and just in life in general, what happens is that as you gain more experience, you realize that, you were a lot dumber than you thought. So I will often say to students, maybe you can suspend your disbelief for 1 minute and imagine that your teachers know more than you. This is the thing, right? So maps and compasses, who needs those? Well, he's embarrassed now to admit that he was wrong about that. And in fact, nature is much more dangerous and different than he expected. So he gives some more examples of that we'll talk about. But also, he's overestimated his capacity. And here specifically, what's interesting is that he is lacking the map and compass skills. So if we think about those as symbols, what do maps and compasses do? They give us direction. When we meet Crabbe and when we find out about his home life, we know that he is lacking direction. He's planning to escape his final exams. He runs away from home. He doesn't like the life trajectory that has been mapped out for him, if you will. And so he now is realizing that it was actually really silly for him to assume that you don't need a map in life. Okay, so that's like a really key learning aspect that we're getting in the context of nature, but applies to Crabbe's life in general, of course. So more specifically, though, he says that the problem was he was more concerned about getting away than he was about coming back. He's more concerned about what he's leaving than what he's going to. And I think that this is definitely showing us that that is a miscalculation, not an uncommon one, but it's giving us some pause to reflect. So Crabbe notices that if all you care about is getting away from a situation that you deem difficult, which you might even have to admit you were wrong about, to go somewhere that you don't think about, to just mindlessly run away, doesn't seem to be the answer. So we notice too that the place he's looking for is a place that he's been with his father. I've mentioned a couple times that he has some obviously resentment, but struggle with authority and clearly a complicated relationship with his own father. And it is in light of this mapping out his life and trying to tell him what to do. Yet when he escapes, the place that he thinks to escape to is the campsite that he's gone with his father. So it's clearly significant. And if you haven't noticed the father-son thing, it's hitting us over the head. So he's trying to recreate this good memory that he has with his dad. He's been sort of fantasizing about it, projecting, to it, so much so that he just thinks, I'm going to go to this great fishing place. He has good memories there, but he doesn't actually plan the course of action. And I would say that we see this a lot with, I'll say, young people and students, right? you have an idea about where you want to go, but you're really ignorant to the sort of steps that it takes to get there, and not by any fault of your own or their own. But like that's the difficult part, right? The actual journey itself. And so we're watching Crabbe go through that. So we also find that the weather is not exactly what he expected. In fact, it's much darker, much wetter, and much colder than he thought it was going to be. Um, okay, he has this interesting observation as well about darkness. So darkness is symbolically, right? Darkness and light are traditionally negatives and positives. And he references here for us the fact that he's read a lot of books. And so it's not surprising necessarily that he has these literary observations. Um, I think it also adds to our idea that Crabbe he is smart, right? But I think it even draws a parallel between book learning versus, street smarts and real life experience. We've seen that a lot. There's a part in the very beginning when he talks about how he's writing this journal as if something that you have to do in school, but he's noting the fact that it's actually really relevant in real life, but that he's learned it in this context that gave him resentment about it. And the journals in school didn't necessarily prepare him for like the real need in real life to write a journal, or at least he was never writing them for the same purpose as he is now. So I would say that we get a similar comparison here between school learning and real world experience. Because he says as he's sitting there, darkness doesn't really fall. It doesn't come from above, but it comes from below. And I think we can think about that imagery symbolically as well. So it seems to rise from the floor of the forest, um, like as if the light is trying to escape the blackness that wells up from the earth. I mean, Crabbe just explained to us how he was trying to escape his life at home, right? And now he's watching the light do that as well. And of course, the darkness is winning. But later on, he does say, that dawn, a sunny day greeted him. Where was it? That the next day I got up as soon as I gratefully saw dawn's rosy fingers. So, a new day does come. And guess what? You can feel a lot better on that day, even though the darkness is still inevitably going to come. So perhaps a life lesson for us in this chapter. And if you need me to say it, it's that, things might seem really bad, but, not thinking about where you're going, just trying to escape the blackness is potentially something that you can't actually do because the problems come with you. And yet a new day might dawn. Okay. Um, so the other thing is that the woods are very, very noisy. So he talks a lot about this appreciation for nature that kind of goes away when you're faced with the elements. And I think we can again think back to his life, right? So he's been trying to escape his life, but maybe he hasn't realized the fact that he's been so miserable that he forgot to take in the scenery. Okay, he notices that the nature is beautiful and it's alive and it's busy and there's all kinds of things there and the waterfalls are nice, but the blackness still comes. Um, and it's really hard to notice beautiful things when you're under stress. So maybe, for example, your family dynamic, when there's stressful things going on, it might be difficult to, feel the relationship, feel the beauty of those human interactions because you're so distracted by the negative things. Okay. Now this is interesting too. So in the darkness, he starts to imagine insane killers who would invade my campsite and knife me with huge curved blades, or another bear seeking to chew me up, or the same bear coming back to finish the job, and then bam, then comes loneliness. So I think that we have some intrusive thoughts here. We have some panic. We have him kind of going down this road of worst case scenario, maybe some anxiety, maybe some depression. I'm not diagnosing anyone, not medical advice. But it's quite interesting. I mean, he did say that he's a reader, so, maybe some teenage fantasy here, but he's going to worst case scenario. I mean, he did get attacked by a bear already. But that darkness really overwhelms him in a lot of ways. And that's normal. But as I've already said, the sun does shine the next day and he survives. He also refers here to this womb, which is interesting. So, I mean, he's talking about literally his sleeping bag inside of his tent, but he does refer to it as a womb, aka, the safety of your mother, right? Going back to your roots. That sort of imagery is there for us. And the dread that he's feeling right now is not actually loneliness, or sorry. So he a crab anxiety attack before, but this is not the same kind of dread. So this is like a true, real fear. I think he's drawing a line here between the anxious fears that made him drink in his old life, where he wasn't actually in any physical danger, versus now where he actually is in physical danger. So if you know anything about anxiety or the way that your body reacts to stress, it's sort of like a miscommunication about the danger that you're in, right? So you're reacting to a situation as if you are in like a fight or flight response, is because you are terrified for your life, even though consciously you might realize that, you're not actually in any physical threat. So I think Crabbe is pulling those apart for us here. And he notices that loneliness is a big part of this. So I would argue that he almost has to go away. He has to get out of that situation in order to start to appreciate it. And that he's identifying that one key thing is loneliness. And he does refer to the alcohol, the vodka, as like the Silent Sam vodka, as a person, right? He personifies it. And I mean, Silent Sam is the answer to his loneliness. So has he really been connecting with people in the past? If you've already read this whole novel, then you know that, eventually Crabbe does learn to connect people, right? So I think we're highlighting here the fact that his loneliness before, he's treated with substances, and it hasn't been effective. Um so he's now also, we notice, suffering from withdrawal symptoms. So the shivers that chilled me are not from the cold. There was another one too that he mentioned. Yes, that he was jumpy, and he has to admit that Silent Sam's abscess has a lot to do with that absence. So the fact that he is coming down from a serious alcohol addiction, you can actually die from that. Obviously, Crabbe's isn't that severe, but he does have physical symptoms such as shivering and, being on edge. So he does have like a real physical addiction that we're seeing manifest as, I would argue, nature's healing him. Even though it's hard and scary, he's going through hard things in order to face his loneliness and anxiety and cure his substance abuse. He says, it's been a long time since I'd cried, and a long time since Sam was able to convince me that I didn't really need anybody. So he's admitting some big things here, right? So, first of all, that he had been using vodka to cure his loneliness, but also that it hadn't been working for a very long time. And so, interestingly enough, he happens to be trying something else now, probably without purposely trying it. But he's finding that this approach is obviously having a different effect. So it was an uneventful day, he kind of says, except for the part that's really eventful. Even the rain is making him feel more lonely. And then he says it's funny how the weather affects you when you're living outdoors, though, which I think is funny because he just said that he's a big reader, and that's called the pathetic fallacy, right? When the weather can imitate human emotions. But he's saying that, the weather really can change your mood he's saying it in a more practical sense, but I feel like that is a shout out to some literary device. Okay, so he's kind of refreshed in the morning, and he feels like he's starting to get his feet under him. His practiced, he practiced his rudder technique, and he's getting a little bit more confident. It seems like he is learning how to portage, like he's got a system down. And yeah, he says that. So also, this is a key idea here. If you were a science buff, which I wasn't then, this implies for us that in the future he might be. So we're getting a sense of maybe where he's going with this. Obviously, we know he survives the ordeal in the hospital and has his fingers amputated, but we don't know yet how the story actually goes until then or after that. But it sounds like he does spend more time in nature. And so he's saying that he saw tons of good wildlife. I already mentioned this, but that he couldn't appreciate it because he was in this difficult as hell, mucky, situation, and he lost all of his patience and appreciation at this point. So again, as part of that, he says, partly due to my wariness, I wasn't paying attention, and even if I was, I probably didn't have the tools to save myself. So let's just listen to that again, right? I wasn't paying attention. We already know he came into this thinking that he knew more than he did. He underestimated the difficulty. He overestimated his own ability. And now he's finding that, of course, when he was faced with the problems, he realizes, and he's admitting it, which is key for us. He's admitting that he didn't have the tools anyways. And so he pushes on and he happens to go over a waterfall. I will go through here. There was oh yeah, so this is the second part where he says he's embarrassed. So I think too, there's this sense that maybe young people feel that your image is really important. Um, we see a lot of bullying in high school and cliques and these types of things. And I think Crabbe has this reputation that he tries to uphold of being really cool, right? He doesn't want to be well prepared. He's the cool guy. And he's realizing, I think, how silly that is, right? He's going to die, his likely death, and yet he feels embarrassed because he probably looked funny when he was going over the waterfall. And I think that him reflecting on that, in a laughable way is also helping him to sort of come out of his shell and realize that the real world is a lot different than high school, right? The problems that he had at home are not life and death. And those two worlds are merging a bit here because he didn't even have time to blush because the real world is there, right? He doesn't have time to opt out of that or to worry about it because he actually might die. The other really important thing is that his packs that have been keeping him alive fly out of the canoe as it goes over the waterfall, understandably. But this is important that one of them bashes his arm against the gunwale, and I felt a searing pain as the buckle slashed open my forearm. If you recall the first chapter in the hospital, they are concerned that he tried to kill himself, and because he has a scar on his wrist. And so we've just found out now how the scar came to be. As you can guess, it was absolutely, or as you can tell, absolutely in no way was he trying to kill himself when he got that scar. We still don't know for sure if he didn't try to kill himself. But the scar that they are so suspect, that Dr. Brown is suspicious about, is absolutely not from trying to kill himself. And then this part here, there's two things: darkness and cold. I felt darkness and cold. Everybody has, but the darkness was dead, a chilling liquid, and he was slowly sinking into it. And then the cold, it invaded and creeped and congealed. So what I notice about both of these descriptions is that they happen really slowly and they invade all of these spaces that he has, right? His nostrils, etc. And then they congeal. So that means that they kind of firm up inside you. And I think that we've seen Crabbe be very cynical. We know that his opinion about his life at home is obviously negative, but that he's getting new insight into that. And I think we need to think a lot about the way that things get worse for someone. And we can take this idea here. So it's the darkness and cold. He says everyone's felt it, right? So he's not saying that this is something that's specific to necessarily falling over a waterfall in the wilderness, but that it took me over and turned my bones to dark ice. I think there's a lot of forewarning here or foreboding. Anyway, thinking about how things get so bad. So how did things get to the point that they felt so bad for Crabbe that he needed to run away and that he felt like his life was horrible? Slowly, probably. Slowly those things sunk in and then made themselves at home, and before you realize it, everything's cold and dark. And then we have another major plot point, of course, is that we meet this graceful woman who is naked, coming from the sea and laying down with him. Now we know he's in a river, so he describes it as an erotic dream, most likely. Obviously, it's not a woman coming from the sea, and she melted the ice away. But when he does open his eyes, he is looking at a face, and of course, we'll continue reading on. But if you've read the novel, then you know that this is another really important character. And the way that he meets her as his savior is probably also significant. And he obviously thinks she's beautiful, which highlights for us the male-female dynamic, and will color probably for us a few of the interactions that lay ahead. So I'm going to leave it there for this chapter, and I will see you in the next one.